Well, Thanksgiving is just around the corner, huh? Everyone's thinking about, turkey and pumpkin pie. But we're going to dive into something a bit different today. Going to challenge some of the things we think we know about the history of Thanksgiving.
Sounds like a plan. What sources are we looking at today?
We're going to be taking a look at this 2017 blog post from the Library of Congress by Stephen Winnick. And he really digs into some common misconceptions about, the first Thanksgiving way back in 1621. Get ready to have your assumptions challenged. We're going to uncover a story that's a lot richer than you might expect.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where do we begin?
This blog post actually uses a New York Times article as like a jumping off point. And it claims that the 1621 feast in Plymouth is like the only origin of our modern Thanksgiving. They even say, and this is a quote, "It's from this that we derive Thanksgiving as we know it."
That's quite a claim. I'm going to guess it's not entirely accurate.
Yeah, not quite. I mean, it's true that the 1621 feast was a significant event, but it's just one piece of a much bigger historical puzzle.
So Thanksgiving wasn't just born out of that one gathering.
Nope, not at all. In fact, Thanksgiving celebrations were already happening long before the Mayflower landed. We're talking Thanksgiving events in places like Texas, Florida, Virginia, and even Maine. Imagine that. Thanksgiving in the Sunshine State.
Wow, that really changes my perspective. I had no idea Thanksgiving had such deep roots in different parts of early America.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, right? And it gets even more interesting. Starting way back in 1777, Congress began proclaiming National Thanksgiving Days. These proclamations were happening way before the story of the 1621 feast was even popular.
So there was already a national tradition of Thanksgiving separate from the Pilgrim story.
Exactly. Even Abraham Lincoln's famous Thanksgiving proclamation in 1863, the one that kind of solidified the holiday, didn't even mention the 1621 event.
This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about Thanksgiving. It seems like the 1621 feast was later woven into the narrative of a holiday that already existed.
You got it. It wasn't until the 1840s and 50s, after primary accounts of the 1621 feast were published, that people really started connecting it with Thanksgiving.
Okay, so what exactly are these primary accounts? What do they actually tell us about the 1621 feast?
We have firsthand accounts from two colonists, Edward Winslow and William Bradford. Their writings give us a glimpse into what happened. But of course, like with any historical source, we need to read them carefully and consider the context.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of context, let's go back to that New York Times article. They made another interesting claim about the 1621 feast that caught my eye. They said there's no evidence that the Wampanoag people were even invited.
That's right. I was surprised by that, too. The word invitation isn't explicitly used in the primary accounts, but both Winslow and Bradford do describe the colonists entertaining and feasting 90 Wampanoag for 3 days.
Whoa, that's a pretty big group to just show up unannounced. If they were hosting and feasting them for 3 days, it makes you think there had to be some kind of invitation, right? Even if it wasn't formally stated.
Exactly. It really makes you wonder what an invitation even meant back then. Makes you think about whether actions speak louder than words, right? What do you think, listener?
It's fascinating to think about those pre-Mayflower Thanksgiving events.
Yeah.
What were they like?
I'm curious about that, too. It seems like they were more about, religious observance, expressions of gratitude for blessings, like a good harvest or safe travels.
Makes sense. Probably more solemn, community-oriented, maybe involving prayer and fasting as well as feasting.
And it's worth noting that these weren't isolated events. They were happening all over the colonies. So the concept of giving thanks was already a big part of early American culture.
Right. And then, like we talked about earlier, Congress started issuing those National Thanksgiving proclamations in 1777, way before the 1621 feast became part of the story.
Yeah, so even in the middle of a war for independence, they were still taking time to express gratitude and be together as a nation. Pretty powerful, huh?
It really is. And then there's Lincoln's 1863 proclamation, the one that really made Thanksgiving a national holiday, celebrated on the last Thursday in November.
Yeah, and his proclamation came at such a heavy time during the Civil War. He was calling for a unified nation to come together in gratitude for what they still shared.
It's incredible to think about how all these different things, the religious stuff, the national proclamations, and even the 1621 feast all came together to make the Thanksgiving we know today.
It really is like a tapestry, huh? Woven from different traditions and events.
Yeah, exactly. And each one adds to the richness of this holiday.
This makes me think about how that New York Times article kind of downplayed all these other influences and focused only on the 1621 feast. Why do you think they did that?
Tough to say for sure. maybe trying to make it a simpler story. Sometimes, to make history easier to understand, we miss out on the nuances.
That's a good point. And as we've seen, oversimplification can lead to misconceptions and inaccurate narratives. It's a good reminder for us to be critical thinkers and always dig a little deeper.
Totally agree. And that's where those primary sources are so helpful. They let us go back to the original accounts and come up with our own interpretations, instead of relying on secondary sources that might be biased.
Speaking of primary sources, something's been bugging me. That Times article claims the 1621 feast is the basis of Thanksgiving, but the author also criticizes other historians for misrepresenting those same sources.
That is kind of contradictory, isn't it? It really shows how important it is to be careful with historical accounts. We need to ask, who wrote it? What biases might they have? What sources did they use? It's like being a detective, right? Carefully examining the evidence.
Exactly. And even then, we might never have the full picture. But trying to find it is what makes it so interesting. It helps us understand not just the past, but how our view of it changes over time.
It brings up a key point. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about engaging with the past, questioning what we think we know, and being open to the possibility that what we've been told might not be the whole story.
Yeah, it's about being curious and allowing ourselves to be surprised by what we find.
And those surprises, those discoveries, are what make exploring history so rewarding.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember about how Thanksgiving came to be?
I think the most important thing is to recognize that Thanksgiving, just like history itself, is multi-layered and complex. There's no one right answer, no one definitive narrative. It's about understanding that all these things, the early religious observances, the national calls for gratitude and unity, and even the 1621 feast, all played a part in creating this unique and meaningful holiday.
So we've debunked some myths about Thanksgiving and talked about how it evolved over time, but what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
And what really stands out to me is how this deep dive shows how important primary sources are. Whenever we come across these historical narratives, especially ones that seem like too simple or challenge what we think we know, it's so important to go back to those original accounts.
Right, we often just accept common knowledge without questioning it. But like we saw with Thanksgiving, those stories we think we know can be based on misunderstandings or incomplete information.
Exactly. Sometimes there's even a deliberate attempt to shape the narrative.
Yeah. And this applies to so much more than just Thanksgiving. It reminds us to be critical thinkers and to question what we hear and to remember that history is rarely black and white.
It's like we've been saying, history is full of layers and contradictions, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about actively engaging with the past and digging deeper and considering different viewpoints.
It's almost like a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes those historical contradictions are the missing pieces that make the picture more complete.
Love that analogy. And like solving a puzzle, uncovering those missing pieces can lead to those aha moments.
For sure. And those moments can be really empowering. They give us the tools to look at information carefully and separate fact from fiction and form our own opinions.
It sounds like you're encouraging a much more active way of learning about history, one that goes beyond just accepting what we're told.
Exactly. History is about understanding ourselves and our societies and the forces that have shaped our world. And the more we engage with the past, the better we are at dealing with the present and the future.
Well said. So as our listeners gather around their Thanksgiving tables this year, hopefully with a bit more knowledge about where this holiday came from, what's the one thing you'd want them to remember from this deep dive?
I'd say approach all those historical stories with a healthy dose of curiosity and a bit of skepticism. Ask questions, seek out those primary sources, consider all sides of the story, and always remember what we think we know might not be the whole story.
That's great advice. And as we wrap up this episode, here's a final thought for our listeners. Knowing that historical narratives are often more complex than they seem, what other common knowledge, facts, or stories might benefit from a deeper look? What other assumptions could we challenge?
We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep uncovering those fascinating layers of history. You never know what surprising truths you might find.
And who knows? Maybe your own deep dive will challenge what everyone thinks they know and inspire a whole new understanding of the past. Until next time.